You are listening to Setting History Straight with Linda Watson.
None. But let's go ahead and get started here.
You betcha.
So Dan, how are you?
So much to talk about, and it's so great to be on your show. Thank you very much.
And we're going to be talking today. I'm telling you, this is one of my favorite subjects. This was when I started studying history. This was the piece that just fascinated, and that is the story of the Messiah going into Britain. So that's what we're going to cover today, at least pieces of it, right? It'll be probably two parts to this show. Is that right?
That's correct. We're going to cover first when Jesus went to Britain, and also then we'll be talking about a small town in Britain called Glastonbury.
Yes.
And that's where has so much history.
Yes.
And that's where has so much history there, and it's going to take two parts on, I think, to discuss this and go through all the facts and all the information that we have on that.
Yes, they fully believe that the Messiah was there, and there's much information. So let's go. Like I said, it's one of my favorites.
It's one of my favorites too, Linda. So we can go back, say, 3,000 years ago. And we know that there is great tin trade between Israel, the Phoenicians, and Great Britain in Cornwall. And so that's been going on for 3,000 years. And they've almost been taken tin out of that whole time, out of that area. So there's lots of trade. We know that the Israelites went to Britain. We know they went to Ireland. And there's such history in Cornwall, which is the southwest tip of England. And that's where we find Penans, which was a Phoenician trading colony, and also Israelite colony, as it's also called Mer Zion. That's the name town, and it's still called that today, meaning it's
weeping for Jerusalem.
Weeping for Jerusalem, exactly. So we know that they've gone there. So we're going to go from his young age till 12 until he was 30. There's 18 missing years there. And where did he go? How do we know that he's a carpenter? Well, all the Christians say, Jesus was a carpenter. Well, how do we know this? Where does this come from? Well, there's a lot of legend in this. Where does this come from? Well, there's a lot of legend in England about this. But, there's also things of Jesus traveling to Japan, India, North America, and also Britain.
Yes.
And we know Japan, and it's come to my attention that there was a lot of Israelites or European people that lived in Japan called the Ainu people. So There's a chance that maybe he did go there to Japan.
Possible.
So why he would go there to visit them possibly. And I'm sure if we look into the traditions of the Ainu, I'm sure maybe their history, ancient history, they talk of Jesus being there. And also in India, they said he went to India, but was it Parthia? Was it the Kushan Empire? We know that those were Israelites, nations that went into India.
We have a letter that was written to the king of Scythia from the Messiah. That's actually there's a copy of that letter still today, meaning that he had some association with the tribes that were in that northern region.
Yes. And so we know that the Scythians went into, the Massagetae, and we talked about during our talking about the Israelites going east on their migration, and we know that all the names of those nations, Afghanistan and Afghanistan and Zebulun and Sakistan, that's all that part of India, and that's where the Israelites would have been. So there's a good chance that he did. And I know I have people at work, and they're of East Indian origin. And they said they can give me information on Jesus in India. So They have given me a PowerPoint, but I have not had a chance to actually follow up on that. So, and then we know that in North America, I think it's the Mormons have talked about Jesus being in North America too, and I think it's in their writings and in their Mormon Bible. So I'm not the Book of Mormon.
True. Yes, the Book of Mormon covers that.
In the island of Avalon, near the little Somerset town that is called today Glastonbury. How would he get there? Why would he be interested in going if he's traveling around the world, or especially to England? What was it that got him there? And we have to look at his great uncle, who is Joseph of Arimathea.
Right.
And that was Joseph of Arimathea took apparently Jesus on trips to England because he was a tin trader. They said that he went on numerous voyages to England, And there's lots of tradition, legend in Cornwall of Jesus being there. So we're going to kind of go through those and discuss this. And this is even to this day, there's the legends still persist. So Joseph of Arimathea was the guardian of Jesus and Mary after Mary's husband died, and so he was very involved with Jesus in his early life.
That's why
Dobson,
he was able to claim his body.
That's right, exactly. And we'll go through that.
He was able to claim his body.
That's right, exactly. And we'll go through that later on as we go along and more about Joseph of Arimathea. But this is the connection that they have. Is that how did he get to England? Well, his great uncle was dealing in trade between Cornwall and the Mediterranean and the Romans. The Romans need the tin for their armor out of the tin and make them in ingots, and they're taking them back to the Middle East and into the Mediterranean. There's C.C. Dobson writes, as a boy, he, Jesus, was brought merely for a visit by Joseph of Arimathea on one of his voyages. Later, as a young man, he returned. And settled at Glastonbury for the purpose of a quiet study and prayer. He erected for himself a small house of mud and wattles. So that's where we get the part of being a carpenter. He built himself a house and a home. Yes. We're going to talk about that because that small house that turns into a chapel. So he used it as a chapel and to pray to the Father, and also he lived in it. And that wattle house was one of the main reasons people came in pilgrimages to Glastonbury. That was built by him. So now we know Jesus. Apparently, this in legend sailed up the Brune River to Glastonbury from the banner of the parish church of Milton, 6 miles from east of Glastonbury. So they have it in their church that Jesus came up the Brune River to Glastonbury to the small little establishment of town that was there. Now, people realize when you go to Glastonbury now, which I was there in September, it's 21 miles inland from the Bristol Channel. But back in those days, because of the receding oceans, it actually now is 21 miles from the ocean to Glastonbury. But the ocean used to come right up to Glastonbury, and they had a small little village there. So yeah, so that's quite interesting because I was asked. I've only thought it was about 6 miles, but I talked to the people in Glastonbury that actually deal with this 2,000 years ago when Christ was there. They above the Chamber of Commerce there in Glastonbury, and they said no, it's 21 miles from the ocean. So that's how far the ocean has receded. Yes. And so this is in the church where it talks about the parish where that Jesus came up this river, the Brue River, to Glastonbury. William of Malmesbury, came up this river, the Brue River, to Glastonbury. William of Malmesbury, including in his writings, was given a letter by Ina to Glastonbury in 7 A.D. to the ancient church situated in the place called Glastonbury. This the church and the great priest and the chiefest minister, formerly through his own ministry of the angels. This confirms Gladys' statement that Jesus had a ministry in Glastonbury. So it's recorded in a letter by King Ina in 7 A.D. that Jesus had a ministry in Glastonbury. So there's lots of written, as we go along, there's stuff that's written about this up, and the church has not followed this up. Also, historian Gladys says that Jesus' light and perception was afforded to this island during the last of the reign of Tiberius, and Tiberius retired in 27 A.D. So Tiberius being the Caesar of the Roman Empire. So he connects that right with them. In Raymond Capp's book, ancient carvings on the stone arch of Place Manor Church as an insignia of an anchor, a lamb, and the cross. The pictorial tells the story of Jesus and his uncle coming to this place for tin. So it's right on a church now in Cornwall. Wow. So there's lots more there, and these are all legends, or sometimes we have evidence of Jesus being there.
They have a picture of a man and a boy in a boat.
Yes.
And that is all over Glaston. It's on some of the official buildings.
Right. I use that in my part. Jesus and Joseph of Arimathea there. It's that in that picture, and it's very well throughout Cornwall. Exactly. There were rich seams of tin to be found in the mines near Penance. One of them being the Ding Dong mine near Penwith, where historian Lewis says Jesus as an uncle talked to miners and shared food and drink. Another traditional story is that Jesus teaching the miners of Cornwall how to smelt tin from ore. And that was Jesus himself. And these are traditional stories for that area, for Cornwall. There's also in folk songs from Somerset, and also tell the days when he walked among the people of Glastonbury. So these are all traditions that are still going to this day.
So now Somerset, is that a county? What is Somerset? Because I'm not familiar.
It's an area around. That's what I think. It's a province or an area around. Glastonbury. So It's in the southwest corner of England, and also it's called Cornwall. So it's one of the same places. Okay. But one thing I want to tell everybody, but back those days, Glastonbury was not called Glastonbury, but it was actually called Avalon. And we'll get into that. So if I say Avalon and Glastonbury, I'm meaning the same place, because Avalon was a Celtic name, original name, and Glastonbury came after 500 years later, after Christ, because that's when the Anglo-Saxons came in. And the ocean that was between Glastonbury and the Bristol Glastonbury, Bury meaning town, so you had Glass Town. That was by the Anglo-Saxon. That's how you get that name today. Okay. In Jesus' time, it was known as Avalon. So that's kind of, so we will sort of switch name back and forth. So I want the listeners to understand that it's one and the same. It's one and the same place.
And you know who else was in Avalon, right?
Who's that?
King Arthur.
Oh, that's right. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's the same area. He's part of the royal family that we'll talk about later on, that actually lived in that area, that got Glastonbury going. That Sorrel family, and it's part of the whole royal family of England. That royal line would have come from Brutus, because they were there at the time of Jesus at the time. So there's your connection to Judah, and this is where we'll discuss that family later on as we go along with Glastonbury. So Britain is the very few countries that has songs and hymns about Jesus being here in Britain, explains Lewis. There are so many that seems to be so much information, songs, and there's things that are written and carvings and paintings it to be fictional, because a lot of people say, oh, it's just a fiction, but there's too much tradition in Cornwall of Jesus being there. So we know, and also we found out he built a house at the parish church in Purdy. High on top of Mendips, they have an old saying: as sure as our Lord was at Purdy, a carol sung by the children of Purdy begins with Joseph was a tin merchant, and goes on to describe the arriving from the sea in a boat, and Joseph are mentioned in this song, that coming to Purdy in that area there, which is just outside of Glastonbury. Wow. So there's another one. It's in the song the children actually sing to this day. And it's Purdy's actually 7 miles from Glastonbury. And the ancient coat of arms today, and Arimathea and Jesus as a boy. And it's just outside of Penance and on the coast of England, south coast of England. There's another story. It's how Jesus often anchored their ship in the natural harbor at the mouth of the Kemel River and came ashore to collect water, drinking water, and nearby is an ancient well, and to this day is
very interesting.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, so they came in for water. Oh, this well is regarded as having healing powers. For centuries, pilgrims came to the well and remained in the remains of the chapel erected over it, and are discernible records of its existence back to 13th century. But even then, the origin of its name is unknown. That's from the traditions of Glastonbury. So this well is known for its healing powers too. So this has been going on and written down in the ancient books of England. Also, it's recorded by the ancient Celtic writings that a young Jesus learned both carpentry and spent time with Druid priests. time with Druid priests in Glastonbury.
Perfect sense. Already Sabbath keepers, and they were keeping the law when Joseph of Arimathea had arrived. It was already going on.
Correct. So this is where we get it from a carpenter. But why don't the churches? This is where we get it from a carpenter. But why don't the churches teach this? They, I see Christians say, "Oh, Jesus is a carpenter." Well, how do you know he was a carpenter? Where does it say that? They had to get it from somewhere, right?
Right.
And then also British theologians believe that Jesus may have apprenticed as ship's carpenter to Joseph of Arimathea. So of course he had ships running the tin back into tin from England back to the Middle East or into the Mediterranean. So he would have had to have his ships and had to either build them or repair them. And this is where Jesus had put his skill of being a carpenter together. So you're aware of that. Like we have "God Save the Queen," which is the national anthem of England, right?
Right.
But the second song, their backup song, like you have, "Star Spangled Banner." Then you had "God Bless America," right, as your second backup song to America. And the Brits have, of course, "God Save the Queen." They have the song called "Jerusalem." That is their backup song.
Wow.
They have the song called "Jerusalem." That is their backup song.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's by William Blake. And he wrote in one of the stanzas, it frames here, it says, "And did those feet in ancient times walk upon England's mountains green? And was the Holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen?" From the song.
So that's very interesting that he wrote that. William Blake was a literary giant.
And he wrote, so they took his poem, and made it into their second national anthem. So either they sing "God Save the Queen," or they sing "Jerusalem."
Wow.
So, yeah. And then we have St. Augustine in a letter to the church, constructed by no human art, but divinely constructed or by the hands of Christ himself.
Yes.
He identifies the Royal Islands, the Cyrillian, where the first disciples of Christ found the church built by the hands of Jesus, and it was sacred to himself and his mother Jesus. And it was sacred to himself and his mother Jesus. Now, this is written about what? How long ago was that? That was written about...
Well, St. Augustine would have been 5th century.
5th century, that's correct, yeah. So this is when the records were still... When Glastonbury, as Glastonbury grew, they had all these records. As Glastonbury grew, they had all these records. So that he would have gone there. They had Jesus's, the house that he built, the little wattle house, and it was put on display for pilgrims to come and see for 1,000 years.
Wow. No, I did not know that.
That's right. And actually it got so deteriorated, they put it in lead, and it's actually buried in the grounds of Glastonbury Abbey. And we'll cover that later on. But that's what people came to see it. That was the draw, because Jesus, all across England, across Europe, people came to Glastonbury to see the house that Jesus built.
That's amazing.
In English history, because they keep record of all their history.
Yes.
And it's there. You just have to research it. The first wattled church, which Jesus is described by Anglo-Saxon historian William of Malmesbury in his book De Antiquities Glastonbury. William was commissioned by the abbot of Glastonbury from the archives of the Glastonbury Library. So that's just before everything was burnt, when the Glastonbury Abbey was destroyed by fire. He wrote the history of this. It's been written into this book about Jesus.
Right. Now, he got that information from the books that were around.
The library and the whole church was burnt down. And so he had all this information. There was so much in that Glastonbury fire that they lost everything, but it is recorded in books. It is recorded in books.
And today they pass that off as a legend, do not teach that as accurate history.
Yeah, but the thing is, if it's written and recorded in British history, so how can it be a legend, right? There's so much written down about Glastonbury that this cannot be a legend. There's too much information coming out. It cannot just be a legend, right? So This is actual fact. I'll just talk about this now. We all know the fact. I'll just talk about this now. We all know the Gutenberg press, the first book that was ever printed was the Bible, correct?
Right.
You know what the second book was?
No, I don't know.
It was about Joseph of Arimathea and Jesus being in Glastonbury. That's the second book. And I'll go into that later, who wrote that's the second book. And I'll go into that later, who wrote the book and everything. So it's just like, it's all there. Once you start getting into this, you just can't stop. There's just too much evidence. And I can even get into more of this. It's just my PowerPoint goes for probably about 8 hours. And there's just so much information. And I'm just kind of touching on things here.
Right.
There's another book is from Elvan of Avalon, whose book, De Original Escala Britannica, written in 180 AD, who was schooled at the school of Joseph Arimathea in Glastonbury, his migration out of the Middle East after the Christ's crucifixion. And he writes about Jesus in Avalon and of the church Jesus built and the thousands of pilgrims that came to see it. And that was written in 180 AD.
Now that's amazing information. That is amazing that's amazing information. That is amazing that you have a date going that far back.
Yeah, that's correct. And that would probably be after the death of Joseph Arimathea. That would only be about approximately about 100 years after.
Yes.
Here's a book that writes of Jesus. At 180. So it's only 150 years after, just a little around 150 years after the crucifixion of Christ, that actually this book was written.
That can't be anything but accurate.
How can that be a legend?
That can't be a legend.
Legend is it not just amazing. Also, the dimensions of Jesus' small chapel house, First Wattle Church, is the same dimensions, the tabernacle of wilderness that the Israelites built in the Sinai desert.
Well,
exactly
that was pretty
the same.
big.
It's fairly big. It was written in this book. So it was fairly large. Preservation of ancient history of Glastonbury. So you can go online. I know there's Raymond Camp. You're familiar with him?
Yes, very.
He's written a book called Traditions of Glastonbury. He goes right into everything about Christ in Glastonbury or Avalon. I also have a book that I got most of my information called The Dilemma. I have a book that I got most of my information called The Dilemma of the Disciples. And I had 2 copies. I've given them both out. I used them very well. I used it very well worn out. I got a lot of information. It's by an author named Jowett, Jowett. Actually, I think it's very expensive. There's not many copies around. I think there's like $200. I got mine for about $20, and then found out they're up to $250 on Amazon. So
yes, some of the books that are covering Israelite genealogy are going for the thousands of dollars now.
Yeah,
because they're so rare.
Yeah. Okay, so we got Van Morrison. You know Van Morrison? I'm in England, and these are the words to one part of the song. Won't you meet me down by Avalon in the summertime in England, in the Church of St. John? Did you ever hear about Jesus walking down by Avalon? That was written by Van Morrison. So he even wrote it in his song. So it is mentioned in the Vishnu Purana of India, the book, that Jesus visited wise men in Nepal in the Himalayas.
That doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, the old books in India called Britain the sacred islands of the West. So you got people in India calling Britain the sacred islands. Isaiah and other biblical books tell of the islands of the West and the islands of the sea.
Yes.
Like, the only islands that, if you look, that are west of Israel and Palestine and that, either Corsica and Sardinia, those are the 2 biggest islands. What other islands could they be? Ireland and Britain. Yeah. British Islands laying far west, and Britain is known as the Sacred Islands. Yeah, that's right.
That's amazing information.
Yeah, that's right. Why would Joseph, Arimathea, and Jesus go to Britain? They felt safe. They knew they were among their own people. He can relate to them. Went to Glastonbury. There's a reason why, right?
Yes.
So there's more. There's a reason why, right?
Yes.
So there's a lot more. I've only touched on some parts of Jesus in Glastonbury, Avalon, in Cornwall area. There's lots of legends, lots written. But we're going to go back. We're going to start off. We're going to set the scene up as how Joseph Arimathea after the crucifixion of Christ. But we got to learn who Joseph Arimathea was, and we got to sort of set the scene as why he went there after.
Yes. And before you go there, I just want to make a comment about what you just said, and that is the importance of Britain and Ireland. And Ireland is named after the land of Ariel. It's mentioned in the Bible as another name for Jerusalem. And so the word Ariel is where they get the word Ireland. And they get it from the word Ariel, and Ariel is another name for Jerusalem.
So Joseph of Arimathea, he was a great uncle to Jesus and uncle to Mary. He's a great uncle to Jesus and uncle to Mary, being, of course, the youngest brother of Mary's father. He was a high-ranking member of the Jewish Sanhedrin.
Yes.
Luke mentions that Joseph was a council member, and Mark adds prominent to the term council member. This would indicate This would indicate that he was a member of the great council of the Sanhedrin, or of Sanhedrin of the Jews.
Right.
Yeah, a supreme national tribunal established at the time of the Maccabees. And this is according to the Talmud. Joseph gained his wealth as an importer. Tin trade existed between Cornwall and Judah. So this is mentioned in the Talmud. Okay. Joseph was a man of refined and well-educated, one who possessed many talents and business ability. He was called one of the richest men in the world. Joseph was a member of the ruling political body of the whole country. St. Joseph's official title is given as Nobilis Dicario in the Roman Empire. That would make him a minister of mines with direct access to Pilate himself. So he had a lot of influential power, this Joseph of Arimathea. So he's a well-known man. He was, like I said, well-known of Arimathea. So he's a well-known man. He was, like I said, well-known and well-connected. Also, Gladys Barnicus, one of the earliest British historians, also refers to Joseph as Nobilis Dicario. Joseph owned a fleet of ships under contract to Rome, hauling tin and iron ore from Cornwall, the magnificent harbor of Caesarea in Palestine. So that was the main port there. And then we'll get into that later on. Right. And elsewhere in the Roman Empire. Of course, the tin was one of the chief metal allies in demand by the warring Romans. Fit them with lots of metal for shields and weapons of war. The existence of the tin trade between Cornwall and the Mediterranean Sea is frequently referred to by classical writers and described in considerable length by Roman historian Darius Silicus and also Julius Caesar. So he talks about the tin trade in his own writings, Julius Caesar. So
yes,
it's in his own writings, Julius Caesar. So
yes,
it's amazing how Joseph of Arimathea was quite an influential man. This is a great uncle to Jesus and uncle to Mary. So as we go along, so we know that he's a very influential man. So we're going to go on to the scandal of the cross. Not before the ruling Sanhedrin to explain where Christ's body was. Joseph stood in silence during the accusations. Of course, this is the same Sanhedrin that days before Jesus had stood before. Joseph of Arimathea being blamed as being the prime instigator of the plot because they didn't believe that.
That makes sense.
Well, yeah. The difference between the members of Sanhedrin and the disciples was that Jewish priests insisted the body of Christ was stolen and secretly buried by Joseph of Arimathea and his disciples. The Sanhedrin would not believe that Christ rose. So there's a major problem here. That latter being believing that Christ had risen 3 days before his death, and according to Jesus' own words, that he was going to rise. So as disciples, Jesus saw them, he talked to them, and the Sanhedrin would not believe that because it would go against their teachings, their own teachings, right? So
there's no way they could believe in a resurrection of something
that actually Jesus was in was Joseph of Arimathea's own tomb that he was put into. So his own personal one that he gave to his great nephew, right?
Right.
So yeah. So rooting for vengeance against the followers of Christ from the Sanhedrin, they plotted and planned persecution against the way, which are the followers of Christ. Sanhedrin, under the appointed leadership of a vengeful Saul. We're going to go with this. He had wasted no time striking quickly. The first victim was Stephen, who led the defense of Christ in the court of the Sanhedrin. He was stoned to death.
Right.
The Romans looked upon Saul as getting rid of what they considered an undesirable religious pestilence. During this time, Joseph remained stalwart and fearless protector of the disciples and the women. So that'd be Mary and Mary Magdalene and it says that Saul's fury had no bounds. He defied the Sanhedrin from molesting his person or those he defended. So the Romans are protecting him, and the Sanhedrin are going after the way as best way they can. They stoned Stephen, so things are kind of heating up pretty good after Christ. And it became a losing battle. So in 36 AD, So in 36 AD, the devotees scattered out of Jerusalem and out of Judea. Joseph used his ships to coordinate the followers of Christ and carry them off to safety. The Romans were shocked at the brutality used by Saul and the Sanhedrin, and out of this sprung the cause of their own ultimate doom, as later the Romans turned on the Jews and the Christians, and the Romans put the torch to Jerusalem in 7 AD to crush their Jewish rebellion. This is the deal with Saul. Saul from the Sanhedrin was on the road to Damascus and came blind. Then his sight came back, and he converted to the way instantly. The Sanhedrin was furious at Saul and ordered him captured or killed. The hunter became the hunted. He searched for Jesus' disciples, and they were reluctant to save him, understanding they filled with suspicion and as much surprise came, yes, Paul. Filled with suspicion and as much surprise came, yes, Paul.
Yes.
So we got lots of happening here that at the time from 33 AD to 36 AD, we have the followers of Christ are being hunted down or being chased by the Sanhedrin, and it's getting Prince of Arimathea and Mary Magdalene in that group there. So in the year 36 AD, Joseph, Arimathea, and Mary, mother of Jesus, leave not a trace of their permanent exile in the Bible and now pass on to secular history. Okay, so we pick up the story of Joseph of Arimathea. It's a writer, bishop of Caesarea. His name is Ebius, and he writes, the apostles passed beyond the ocean to the isles called the Britannic Islands. We pick up the story of Joseph of Arimathea in secular history in 36 AD from the harbor of Caesarea, when there are 12 fugitives in 36 AD from the harbor of Caesarea, when there are 12 fugitives on the run from the Sanhedrin are mentioned in history. And how do we know that these? Yes, that's right, 12. So it's mentioned by this bishop of Caesarea. He wrote this in 263 AD. But how do we know that these 12 people, who they were? The names of the castaways in the boat that are leaving Caesarea and secretly leaving are given as Joseph of Arimathea, Mary Magdalene, Martha, Marcella, Lazarus, Maximin, and others mentioned are Philip, James, accompanied by Joseph, Mary, mother of Jesus, occupied this boat. And how do we know the names of these people? The historian Cardinal Baroness of the Roman Catholic Church. He was the first Catholic historian and the curator of the famous Vatican Library, who, in quoting from his Eschatological Annals, D. And Joseph of Arimathea and his companions in the year the party mentioned was exposed to the sea in a vessel without sails or oars. The vessel drifted from Caesarea and finally landing in Marseille, France, where they were saved. From Marseille, France, passed to Britain, and after preaching the gospel there, he died no Baroness. And he quotes Acts of Magdalene and other manuscripts in his possession. So he's written quite about the movement of Joseph of Arimathea and the group of 12 from Caesarea to Britain. And also historian Raymond Capt wrote, without sails and oars, they drifted with the wind, and the currents arrived unharmed first at Cyrene in the northern Africa, and then they crossed the Mediterranean. After obtaining sails and oars, the little party of refugees followed the trade route of the Phoenician merchant ships as far as Marseille, France. And while in Marseille, France, the group was met by Apostle Philip, one of the 12 apostles. Philip later became the Apostle of Gaul, which is today's France. The history appears in early Gaelic church record. Word got out in Britain that the group were in Marseille, and King Arvigas, Joseph of Arimathea, and of Mary. The Druids relayed messages that King Arvigas offered them land and safe haven and protection from the Romans. Joseph of Arimathea gladly accepted. The group traveled up the Rhone River from Marseille, then into Brittany, to the port of Morlaix and into Cornwall. To the port of Morlaix and into Cornwall. Britain at this time was inhabited by Celtic people who spoke Cymric, and Joseph spoke Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Aramaic language. So he was very familiar with, with his trade, that he was able to speak many languages. And it's all written down. He was able to speak many languages. And it's all written down by historians and following this group coming from Glastonbury. So they were on the run out of the Middle East to go to safety into Britain. Of course, Joseph knows people already because he's been trading with these people. He's already familiar with the inhabitants of. Because he's been trading with these people. He's already familiar with the inhabitants of Cornwall.
Yes.
But it's interesting. What I just wrote there, or what written down, is that the Celtic people spoke Cymric. That's like Gymri, right?
Yes. Can I interject right here? Because Gymri would have been the way that it was pronounced throughout the Middle East, but the Assyrians didn't use the K sound, they used the G sound, so they were called Gymri. So
that's right. That's
where you get that name, and Gymri is the name that the Middle East gave the Israelites. Israel came to supreme power under Omri, which was a very wicked pagan, but God did allow them to prosper immensely at that time.
Yeah. So when I was in the British Museum in September, I actually saw the black obelisk, and I saw the writings on there of the Gymric on, and it's written right on, it explains it and everything on right next to in English what it actually says on that black obelisk.
Right, that black obelisk has Jehu, another king of Israel. There's much information about the people, king of Israel. There's much information about the people who just not been taught it.
That's right. Now I find this interesting, where this comment I just made about this Celtic people spoke Cymric. I don't know if you're aware, but Wales. They have the flag there. It has the dragon on it. It's the only nation in the Western Europe flag on the back of their cars.
Oh.
Yeah, and you know what it says underneath it?
No.
Gymri. Exactly the same name that the Assyrians called the Israelites is written on, except that you do it with a K. And if you look out in the internet and you look up Cymri, and you'll see that it has the Welsh flag and the exact Israelites.
Yes, I mean that is that's amazing.
Yeah, I saw it one day and I thought, what? I'm very familiar with this story, and I saw that. I've never talked to them, but every time I go and I start looking on the internet for it, it's exactly the same name. So those would have been the same people that moved out of the Middle East and are actually Wales uses that name to call their own people.
The book called The Tribe, which is put out by Jan Davies, he mentions how the tribe of Simeon and some of the tribe of the Levites left out and went to Wales. Out of the area, went into captivity out of that area, Asia Minor, where they were brought in right underneath the Black Sea. And so it's really interesting, because at the time of the Israelites that they had their captivity, I think that's very interesting. Gomeria would have been the same name that we're talking about here.
That's right. So if they left with the Levites, they carried the same name that they were being called back then, and they call themselves to this day.
Yes.
So that proves that they actually migrated from that area. Like you said, it's somewhere central eastern Turkey. If you look at any ancient maps of the Cimmerians, you see them either going into, up into the Jutland, into the Denmark area, or up the Danube River. But some stayed behind and formed a nation of Cimmerians there. Exactly. Once they left there, they headed right to Wales, and they're still to this day called. So how many years later? 20 there. They headed right to Wales. And they're still to this day called, so how many years later, 2,800 years later, are still call themselves by the same name. So here's a huge connection we can make between the Celtic people and the ancient Israel. So this is just out of Jules Arimathea. This is the language they spoke when he arrived, right? And we're going to Britain here in a bit. So, okay, so Joseph and his companions sailed west and around Cornwall through the Bristol Channel until they hit the lofty green hill of Tor, Glastonbury Tor. That's the big hill that you see with a tower on it, which is St. Michael's Tower. Of course,
Yes.
that time they didn't have it then. But they sailed right up there now to this day, or back in those days, they were able to sail right up to Glastonbury. As Dean Alford writes, more likely at Tabor's Holly Mount, or known as today as Glastonbury Tor, and that Tor means hill. And that's again, big hill. I've walked up that hill. It's just a magnificent walk up to the top of that. Again, big hill. I've walked up that hill. It's just a magnificent walk up to the top of that Tor. They made their way up the Brune River, where they talk about Christ going up, and arriving in a cluster of huts. So they went right behind. Actually, this village was right behind the Glastonbury Tor. And this is where that Glastonbury village, not where it is. The Aspiring Island was among 7 islands as known as the Sacred Island of Avalon, sitting among the apple orchards. The isle derived its name from Aval, or the Celtic apple, which is sacred fruit of the Druids. So
Right.
this is how it got its name. Is the Druids actually named it, and it actually means apple. So in the Celtic language.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So there's in Glastonbury they got numerous churches, and in those churches they have stainless glass windows.
Yes.
And it shows you in one of the churches there that the group arriving in Glastonbury with Mary and Mary Magdalene, Joseph Arimathea, shows them come off a boat and walking towards you, sort of thing, right? You've actually seen it myself.
I have
Yeah,
not
that's
seen
right.
it, but I've seen pictures.
All this information that I was able to go and prove that these things were actually there, right? I want to see for myself, I guess, right?
Right.
And there they were, sure enough, in the churches. You just have to go in there and you see it. Well, there's lots of different stainless glass windows, right? Stained glass windows in those with different scenes from when Joseph Arimathea was there. So,
Yes.
a British Druid priest, King Arvigas, and his brother, princes of the royal Srin family of Britain, and entourage of nobles. So he's met by the king of that area, and the royal Srin line, Silures. They're from King Brutus' line of king. Glass window, stained glass windows in St. John's Church in Glastonbury, showing the meeting between Joseph Arimathea and King Arvigas meeting. They're actually meeting. And
Wow.
and Joseph Arimathea is holding a staff, and also, and we'll get in later, into the Holy Grail. Joseph Arimathea, and when Christ is on the cross, collected his blood and on the cross, and he brought that along with him, with the Holy Grail, which we'll get into a little later too.
Well,
So-
now that's interesting.
Yeah, that's how you get the Holy Grail. This is during the Last Supper. That was where they drank out of, the cup that they drank out of, and that's how he actually brought it with him. There's some wells that are around the Chalice well, and that where Joseph Arimathea actually got water out of it, and it's known as a holy well where the waters heal people. Been there too, and that's right below the Glastonbury Tor. So they got the meeting there. But one of the things that the royal family did for Joseph Arimathea and his group, King Arvigas, was they gave him 12 hides of land,
Right.
which is approximately 1,920 acres. And that would become where Glastonbury is today, and the Tor, that whole area, was given to them, and as which he promised them land when they arrived.
You may be
Yeah.
planning on covering this, I don't know. But you can actually go today in a book where that was assigned to Joseph of Arimathea in the...
Right to that right now.
Okay,
This
great.
was this charter by the king was given land dedicated to Jesus Christ, defining them as the hallowed acres of Christum in 36 AD. This is a charter that was all written. It was the first of many charters that this historic sacred spot would receive by many of the British kings and queens during the existence of the church in Glastonbury, or the Glastonbury Abbey. These records are still to this day in the British Royal Archives, and it's called the Domesday Book.
Yes.
Okay, in this book.
Yes.
Okay, and it is in right now. The Domesday Book is in the British Library in London. Actually, it's kind of either called the Domesday Book or sometimes called the Domesday Book. And it means the day of the final judgment. That's just what the book means. And this charter was kept in this book. It was to keep track of who didn't pay taxes.
Right.
That's how they recorded this. And these chapters was basically who was not going to pay taxes, what land, and this kept recorded. So this chapter of this 1,920 acres or 12 hides of land is recorded in this Doomsday Book. Or 12 hides of land is recorded in this Doomsday Book.
Wow.
So you can see it again in the British Library. It's part of British history. Also, documents are recorded by the British Royal Archives too.
Okay, so let's stop right here. In the next part, let's stop right here. In the next part 2, we'll pick up the rest of the story because, we are really out of time now. So you teach this again, we'll pick up from that point. This is amazing information, Dan. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing this with us. And we look forward to having you on again. And I hope everybody understands how much history we have lost. Dan, you have any final things to say?
Well, it's like what I talked about, the Stone of Destiny. If you get a chance to go to England, go to Glastonbury. You get such a great feeling there. I've been there. Did you ever get to Glastonbury, England? It's just a couple hours west of London, England. I would suggest you, a group of you Christians and anybody who wants to see it, to go there and walk where Jesus walked and where Joseph Arimathea walked and Mary walked, and it's all documented by the British government in historian books.
Yes. Okay, with that, we're going to close and we're going to say blessings to all and good night.